So in today's lecture, we're going to be going over engineering ethics. This is an introduction. We don't spend much time in the actual class talking about this. We mostly just, I sort of hand off this topic to a lecture series that's accessible on YouTube. There's a quiz through the course website if you check it, or it's a survey. It's set up as a survey, which basically is, it includes a link to all the videos. So there's about 10 videos in the series. They're each about maybe 15 minutes each, so that you could sit and crank through all these videos all in one sitting. It would take probably a couple hours. It's not too bad. I really like this lecture series. When I first started teaching engineering, well, I've never taught engineering ethics. It wouldn't be ethical because I'm not an expert at engineering ethics. So what I do is I was looking for a good lecture series on the topic, and there's a bunch that want you to pay. There's a bunch of lecture series where it's like, they want you to pay $5 a student or whatever and get a subscription or a license or whatever. But I found this free series that's fantastic. The person who teaches it is really good. So, so today is basically just me jumping ahead of my slides, basically, right? So today is not a meal, it's just an appetizer. So the purpose of this is to put things into context. Before you start watching the videos, before you go through it, I want you to know, why am I watching these videos? Why do I care about engineering ethics? What are engineering ethics? And they go over some of this a little bit, but I'm just trying to kind of set the foundation a little bit more than what the video series does. So the video series that I mentioned is done by Michael Louie from University of Illinois. A really good guy. I've seen him a couple times at conferences. I've spoken with him for a while. Just a good professor, a good expert on engineering ethics, and just a good human being. One of just the nicest humans you'll ever meet. And then of course on this slide, I say the thing that I just said on the title slide. So yeah, so mostly this is just, we're just priming the pump today. We're not actually pumping the water. So I love these dumb little clip art graphics. I'll say, when I was putting this slideshow together, I just got crazy with the slide theme and the clip art graphics. I love cheesy, these just these silly cheesy graphics. I find them they're very funny to me. So anytime I get an opportunity to use the cheap clip art, I'm going to toss it in here. And it turns out when you're looking for anything related to ethics, it's pretty much all just these cheap clip art things. So anyway, there's only about 5 slides in this slideshow, but they all have some cheesy clip art graphic on them. So first of all, what are ethics? So, most people kind of understand ethics have to do with right and wrong. They have to do with, what's right and wrong, good and bad. Ethics just kind of apply structure to this. They are basically related to morality, related to issues of right and wrong. Ethics are basically more thoughtful, theoretical, deliberate attempt to systematically and with structure approach this issue of right and wrong. And so one thing I like to, when talking about ethics, I like to sort of start on a smaller scale. A lot of times people live and they behave and they interact with others without really thinking about why they're doing what they're doing. And one thing I always like to prompt students for is manners, right? Consider manners. Why do we have manners? So to most people, manners as a structural thing is, their grandma telling them not to put their elbows on the table. I don't know if that's still a thing. I've never minded elbows on table. I'm not quite sure where that comes from, but that seems to be the go-to example for manners. But really, what are manners? That's not the only matter of manners that we follow. Well, manners are basically this kind of agreed upon standard set of behavior that we've sort of said as a society, we expect everybody to sort of interact with each other with some base level of respect and decorum. So if I walk up to a stranger on the street, we sort of expect, to not be rude, then I not just kill that person. And that might seem like a silly example, but for a very long time, human societies, that's what they would do. If you encounter somebody and you've never seen that person before, they're gone. And of course, that's not really a good way in modern life. That would be a very rough way to go about living. And especially as, our cities and human human centers of living got bigger, that became, you couldn't really do that. You couldn't just know everybody and kill anybody you don't know. But taken to, maybe a less extreme example, manners are sort of these standards of behavior that if we all agree to treat each other with this sort of base level of respect and decorum, and then life is better for everybody. So it's basically, if I walk up to a stranger on the street, I can assume they're not going to just punch me in the face or kick me in the shin or something. Not only that, but I can generally assume they're not going to like swear at me and insult me or something like that. That we sort of behave with a certain baseline level of, for no reason. You don't have to agree to any terms of behavior. I will treat you with a certain level of respect, and you will treat me with a certain level of respect. Without us, we don't have to form a contract before that. It's just built in. It's baked into our society. That's kind of what manners are. They're these sort of, we all expect to all treat each other this way as a baseline level, right? Some people you might treat better, right? Some people, my family members, sometimes not only do I not kick them in the shin, sometimes I give them presents, right? I'll give them Christmas presents or something, but I'm probably not going to give a random stranger on the street a Christmas present, I'm just not a nice person, right? Not that nice of a person. I'll do the manner standard and that's it. But that's kind of what they are, right? They're these sort of, and the tough thing with things like manners is how do you enforce them, right? You can't, these aren't, obviously some things, like not just shooting a random stranger is a matter of things you can enforce. But we don't really make laws that say, it's a crime to be rude to somebody, right? We're not going to lock somebody in a cage because they said something mean to a stranger. But it's kind of up to everybody to sort of enforce manners, right? If somebody is generally violates expectations of manners, people just kind of start to just not want to associate with them. People start to maybe actively say, I don't want that person around. They're not, they make my friends, people I care about, people who do respect manners, they make them, sad or angry or whatever. And I don't like that person being around. And so there's sort of these non-formal ways that we police manners, right? Or sometimes it is your grandma, like, taking a swing across the dining room table with a salt shaker or something, trying to get you to get your elbows off the table. But a lot of times it's kind of just, these are more just, we just kind of, if somebody's rude, if somebody violates manners, you just don't want to be around them. And so they just kind of get pushed off a little bit and sort of separated a little bit. That's not necessarily the case with ethics. Ethics are sort of a similar concept, but there can be much more formal structure to ethics, especially professional ethics. Sometimes there's very formal structure, very formal mechanisms for enforcing these standard expectations. But the core is sort of the same. Ethics are kind of this, it's the systematic investigation of in what ways should we behave such that if we all behave this way, everybody's better off. And so ethical frameworks can mitigate aggregate effects of behavior. So sometimes there are things where, that some behaviors, it might not seem like that big of a deal for one person. Like let's just say, something like, if I'm on a boat and I, finish off a 6-pack of cold ones, right? I could take that little plastic ring thingy and I could just throw it overboard, right? It's a big ocean, throw it overboard. And it might not seem, it's probably not that big of a deal, for one person, right? I'm going to get in trouble. So it might not seem like that big of a deal if just one person throws a little 6-pack ring overboard. But, there's billions of people out there. Eventually the effect of everybody engaging that behavior is you get a bunch of those sad pictures of the sea turtles, a little thing around them, right? And everybody sees the picture and it's compelling. And now everybody sort of snips their plastic rings before they heavily consume beer, right? So, or after they heavily consume beer, right? But there, so some of this stuff is, ethics are useful not only for mitigating, those individual one-on-one interactions where it's obvious why it's bad, right? I don't want to get kicked in the shin. So, a stranger comes up to me, please don't kick me in the shin, right? But it's also the stuff where it might not necessarily be as apparent. I just saw the chat window. Yeah. It might not be as apparent, what the harm is, right? It might not be as apparent. Ethics are sort of thoughtful frameworks that investigate those sorts of things. What will happen if everybody behaves this way? Things like that, right? So sometimes it's not always intuitive. Now, morality comes from humans. This is another thing. Morality these are, right and wrong. Concepts of right and wrong come from humans. They don't come from science. So these are not provable things. These are just human values. They come from us. Science generally doesn't care, right? I mean, if science doesn't, you could throw as many plastic rings in the ocean and you can't scientifically prove that's bad. Science can't prove that a planet, like a molten planet with an atmosphere of sulfur, is better or worse than a planet teeming with life, right? That's not a matter of scientific investigation. It's a matter of human values. It's a matter of humans. We like life, right? We like human life. we like people being around. We like sea turtles not to have that sad little ring around them where they're all squished. They grow up and they're kind of squished in the middle. It's sad, right? So, but that's not a scientific principle. That comes from us. That's something in us as humans that says, it's not very, I don't like that. I don't like to see that sea turtle with that thing on it. And so we have to be aware of that these are human values and human principles, things that come from humans. These are not things that come from the natural world. They're not scientifically provable, but that doesn't mean they're not important. I mean, obviously humans care about human things. So these are still very important, and ethics are sort of how we manage these sort of human values. So what is a profession? This is another big thing. So this is one of these areas like manners where you can use the phrase and talk about it and not necessarily I'm reading the chat. This is a very fun lecture for me. I much prefer this to my job. So a profession is something that, a lot of times you'll use the phrase, you'll use the term, you don't necessarily know what it means. So let's talk about what a profession means. So a profession is the application of specialized knowledge. This is the biggest thing. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't help, right? That's about as useful as saying profession. Well, a profession is basically it's an occupation that requires the person practicing it to obtain very specialized knowledge, and that's what all of you have done. So all of you have, Maxwell's equations are not intuitive. I don't know how much you cover Maxwell's equations. I don't know. The node voltage technique is not intuitive. Second order differential equations are not intuitive. You had to gain very specialized knowledge to be able to practice the engineering profession, and that alone isn't necessarily that special, right? Artists, if you're a painter, there's an enormous amount of knowledge you need to obtain to know how to paint properly. But artistry is generally not considered a profession, or at least not in the technical sense. It's not generally considered a profession. The difference is because typically with professions, not only is it specialized knowledge applied, but it's also very difficult for someone who doesn't have that specialized knowledge to tell whether or not you did your job right. It's very hard to verify that you've done your job correctly. So with an artist, maybe it takes 10 years of training for an artist to know proper techniques for using different types of brushes, proper techniques for mixing different types of paints, proper ways for producing textures and things like that. But at the end of the day, anybody, even someone like me who's very not good at appreciating art, can generally look at a piece of art and say, oh yeah, that looks good, that pleases me, or that doesn't, right? You can usually tell, oh, that looks terrible, or not. This is not always true. There's some art, everybody's seen somebody just paints a canvas yellow and it sells for $7 million. So I will admit there's a limit to my ability to assess the value of art, but in general, this concept is there's not much of a risk on my end when it comes to art. That's not true for professions, right? So if your lawyer is doing something that is not appropriate lawyery stuff, you're in trouble. If an engineer is designing an electrical grid to go in your neighborhood and they are not applying their knowledge correctly, you're in trouble. If a doctor is injecting something into your bloodstream and they're not applying knowledge, specialized knowledge correctly, you're in real trouble. So these professions are applying specialized knowledge, but also with a lot of risk to the public and with very difficult to verify on the part of the public. It's very difficult for the public to say, oh, sodium pentathiobutramine, yeah, that should go in my bloodstream. I don't know. I have no idea. I know some things that should go in my bloodstream, but some things, I don't know. So it requires trust. So profession requires trust between the professional and their client. And that trust is very important. It's important not only to the specific professional and the specific client, but it is important to the entire profession itself. If over time people realize every time I go into a doctor, there's a 50-50 chance that doctor is going to inject something toxic into my bloodstream, well, people are going to lose faith in doctors and the profession of doctors is going to deteriorate. I'm already at this point with dentists. This video probably isn't going on YouTube because as far as I'm concerned, the dentistry profession is shady. It's like, I have to find a dentist I trust. That's more important to me than finding a mechanic that I trust because, man, dentistry, professional dentistry organizations, you got to watch yourselves because you are on thin ice. It is like, there's some dentists where it's like, yeah, I think you're just scraping $500 bills out of people's healthy teeth. So anyway, I shouldn't say that. Anyway, I know I say that. Dentistry, watch it, dentistry. You're close. So, all right. So this is different than occupations, right? So occupations versus professions. Occupations are generally, generally referred to the work people do to make a living. But they're distinguished from professions in that occupations it's generally verifiable whether or not somebody did their occupation correctly. Usually it's almost immediately verifiable. There's some areas that are sort of on the threshold of these things. So one of the most controversial professions / occupations is cosmetology. That's why I have the photo of the people. It looks like people cutting hair. I think combing. I'm not sure what's going on. I think people are posing for a photo in this photo, but this is there's a lot of controversy over to what extent hairdressing and cosmetology is a profession. And it particularly applies to the issue of how many requirements there are to practice these things. So some people say, I'm a professor. How many hours of training did I have to get to be allowed to be a professor? Can you see the right? There's no, I didn't have to take any, I had to get a PhD, but that didn't train me how to teach. There was zero training for me to become a professor. I mean, it's just, hope you do well. Here's your first day of class. Hope you do well. Yeah. So basically, going back for the first time to hairstylists. So there's a lot of controversy over to what extent hairstylist cosmetology is a profession or an occupation, and the training requirements for it has to do mostly with how much training is required for these. You might not have seen it when when the video cut out, but I got precisely 0 hours of training to be a professor, and yet I'm a professor. Hairstylists in some places need 200 hours of education to be a hairstylist, and there's a sort of the decision-making process is typically around this notion of, how much trust is required. There is, of course, if you get your hair cut, did I cut out again?
Maybe if you turn off your video and just do audio.
I don't want to do, it's not that, I'm losing my connection here. It's probably my kids logged into school, so they're nuking my internet. I'm just going to keep going through. You can always watch the video later. It'll record fine on my end. It's just not going to show up well for you. So there's this question of there's this question of how much licensing there should be, how much professional licensing there should be for hairstylists, based on this notion of, well, what's the risk, right? What if they don't You get a bad haircut. Is that such a, there is some trust required, but there's the question of what's the cost to the public. There are other things, right, in cosmetology, right? You're using chemicals on people's hair. You are, dipping their heads into baths of things. So there are some other, potential risks involved in it, but it's sort of at this cutting edge of what's a profession versus what's an occupation. And there's also some sort of strange interactions that happen there, because there's the professional licensing, which is a topic we don't really go into here. That has an impact on a profession too. Sometimes it has an impact to increase salaries for the profession, or to exclude competition, or to or to increase the cost of the service. And so there's sometimes the issue of whether or not something's a profession has these sort of other entangled controversies, which I don't really want to get into, but I'm just pointing out this example of hairstyling is sort of, or cosmetology is at this threshold of where people debate, is it a profession or is it an occupation? Following codes is an interesting thing to look at. If you have an electrician versus an electrical engineer, a lot of times my family doesn't seem to understand the difference between that, because they'll call me all the time and they'll say, John, I got a 3-way switch going to this fan, and when one of the switches is off, it doesn't turn on no matter what, and when it's on, then the other one acts as a 3-way switch. Of course, I kind of know what's wrong in that situation, but then they'll usually ask me, like, all right, I'm looking at, there's 3 terminals and one's red and one's black and one's white, and which one should I connect to which? And I have no, I can't help them, right? I'm not an electrician. But electricians typically are not considered a profession. Electricians typically considered an occupation. And a lot of it has to do with electricians follow codes. So electricians, it's a very big code book. It's actually, I don't think I'd be able to be an electrician because it requires memorizing these massive code books. But whether to do A or B as an electrician is based heavily on a list of rules. It's not heavily based on creativity or specialized knowledge. Knowing a rule book is not considered specialized knowledge. That's knowledge that technically anybody can read through the rule book and memorize the rules and follow them. There's of course skill involved in being an electrician, but in terms of the decision-making process and interaction with the public, electricians are usually differentiated from electrical engineers by following code, versus electrical engineers who they apply knowledge more creatively to create designs, and there's more risk, right? An electrical engineer is not necessarily following a code book, so they could be doing something that is, a code book sets the limits of what's safe, what's dangerous. An electrical engineer has a little more leeway, which means a little more risk. So just something I wanted to mention was sort of following codes and not. So professional ethics. So we talked about ethics. We talked about professions. What about professional ethics? So again, I love this. I love these cheesy graphics, right? Professions. So professional ethics, the biggest thing I want you to know going into the video series is professional ethics are not always intuitive. A lot of students think, ethics are, come on, ethics are just right and wrong. They're built into us. They're baked into the fiber of my humanity. And so a lot of people think, I don't need to study for ethics. It's just my mama raised me right. I'm going to just come in, take an ethics quiz, and boom, 100%, because I am an ethical person. Well, that's not always the case with professional ethics. Professional ethics are not always intuitive. Professional ethics are, again, they're this sort of systemic investigation of the application of rules of behavior to determine sort of this kind of aggregate good for the public and for the profession. And a lot of times that means that the ethical way to behave is not necessarily the way that you would think as an individual naturally would be the proper way to behave. I can give some examples in professions of this. There's some very clear, obvious examples. Look at the legal profession. The legal profession in the US, at least, is an adversarial system. So basically you have prosecutors on one side, defense attorneys on the other side, and they have clearly defined roles, and they have a set of professional ethics that define the behavior, the limits of behavior in their acting in each one of those roles. So So for instance, if you are a defense attorney and you're defending somebody who's on trial for murder, and that person says to you, hey, I did it. I killed that person, and here's how I did it, and here's how I got away with it. And you know what? I kind of want to do it again if I get found not guilty, right? Now, of course, this is very painful if you're a defense attorney, right? That this person just admitted to murder. Not only that, but they admitted to, yeah, they think they're still kind of feeling a little murdery. And so you might think naturally, well, of course, call the cops, right? Call the police, call the prosecutor, say, hey, this guy's guilty, and I'm worried he's going to do it again. And actually, of course, that would be the intuitive human ethics. That would be highly unethical, though, for a defense attorney. Highly unethical. So, and the reason for that is because a defense attorney practices within an adversarial system. It is a system set up to achieve this sort of goal of having a legal justice system that people trust, that people know, people think is fair, that people think will, if they enter into it, will give them a fair shake of being found guilty or not guilty. So, that's a clear example. There's other less clear examples, right? And the video series goes into a lot of these for engineering, but, it's easy to think about. If you worked for one company and then you go work for another company, well, the company you're working for, they're nice to you, right? They pay for your kids' braces. They give you money that you go on vacations with. You maybe even get a jet ski with the money they give you. So they've been very good to you. And so when your company says, hey, when you were working at that other company, you were working on this technology, right? And you say, yeah, I was. Well, hey, we're going to put you on a project where you're going to get to put that knowledge to use. And then you might think, oh, okay, they like me. They're good to me. They give me money. I need to help them out and let them know all my specialized knowledge that I gained from that previous company. And, all the things that we learned from working on this project with this other company, now I get to share with this new company. Well, now hold on, right? That might not necessarily be ethical depending on the relationship you had with the previous company and the current company. And so professional ethics is not always intuitive, but it also generally defines methods that you can use to resolve questions. So, a big part of the video series is, what if you don't know, right? Or what if you're unsure about whether or not something's ethical? What are the techniques you can follow to come to an answer? So, also, professional ethics are not always codified in law, but they often are. So one of the challenges of, if you're an electrical engineer, the only people who really have enough expertise to know whether or not you're doing your job right is other electrical engineers. And so usually that means that professional ethics for electrical engineers are created by and for electrical engineers, not generally by legislators, not generally by lawmakers. However, in most areas of the world, lawmakers have recognized the critical importance of certain types of professional ethics. So they've basically taken codes of professional ethics and incorporated them into the law. So in many places, following professional ethics is important not only for your profession and for you, but also it's important to stay out of jail, because sometimes, running afoul of professional ethics can actually be a matter of law, but not always. So there's some things you can do that are very unethical that aren't necessarily illegal. So legality and ethics are not necessarily the same, but there is quite often some deliberate overlap, which, okay. And again, very different for different professions. So the legal profession generally has a highest ethical obligation to justice. The medical profession generally has the highest ethical obligation to do no harm or something else. Engineering generally has the highest ethical obligation to public safety. So just to, the video series talks about that more, but different professions have different sort of highest obligations. And that's used to sort of make decisions. When things are in conflict, sometimes some interests will override others. Okay. So that concludes my rundown. Again, I did not just teach you professional ethics. I just gave you context for the video series that will teach you professional ethics. So I am going to stop recording